During the summer of 1966, an offhand comment made by John Lennon gained worldwide attention, fueling protests against the Beatles and even sparking the burning of Beatles records. The backlash was so severe in the United States that it was one of the deciding factors that led to the band to quit touring altogether. On today's episode of Strange and Unusual Tales, we're going to explore the time when the Beatles were almost canceled. This is the history of what happened when John Lennon said they were more popular than Jesus.
In Longview, Texas, organized a public bonfire of Beatle records.
This small band of small demonstrators was the only sign of protest.
The Beatles made a statement in all the newspapers that they're getting more better than Jesus himself.
Today's episode is brought to you by AG1. So besides my love of music on vinyl, I also really like to work out. I used to run track in high school and college. And over the last 10 years, I've become pretty active in traditional weightlifting. I really like how it makes me feel. And along with that, I have a pretty healthy diet and I supplement with vitamins. The only problem was I had to be careful when I took them because if I didn't have any food in my system, I would feel really nauseous for at least half the day. And so I was a little concerned when I started drinking AG1 that the same thing might happen, but to my relief, it's super easy on my stomach and I love the taste of it. It has kind of like this nutty sweetness to it. And what I also love about it is that it's not just a multivitamin, it's a whole health nutritional drink. It supports my immunity, gut health, brain health, and energy levels. And it's so simple. Before I was taking at least like 4 different vitamins, and that didn't even cover probiotics, which this has. Now it's just 1 scoop once a day and I'm done. I don't even have to think about it and I feel great. Right now you can get a 1-year supply of immune supporting AG1 plus 5 travel packs for free with your first purchase. Just follow the link below. Our story begins on the 4th of March 1966 when the London Evening Standard published their profile on John Lennon. It was part of a series of newspaper columns titled How Does a Beatle Live? And featured interviews with each Beatle on their own and not in their usual group setting. They were written by Maureen Cleave, and she had a closeness to the Beatles that other interviewers didn't have because she had known them since 1963. The Beatles developed a friendship with her, and thus they let their guard down for these interviews. Her profile on John paints a very candid portrait of his private life and gives a glimpse into his home. Interspersed throughout the piece are selected quotes from John, but it's one in particular that is the focus of this video. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. In the article, Maureen adds that John has been reading a lot about religion, and because of their friendship, John felt free to speak candidly to Maureen and didn't think much of his statement. It was just part of their conversation. Even after the piece was published, it really didn't cause much controversy in England. In a 1966 press conference, John said,
"When it came out in England, it was a bit of a blab mouth saying anyway, but they could they must have heard me before anyway, or they took it. A few people wrote into the papers, and a few wrote back saying, so what, he said that, who is he anyway? Or they said, so he can have his own opinion. And then it just vanished. It was very small." And
what's interesting is that John's Jesus comments were published in the US months before any of the controversy took place. It was only after they were printed in Datebook magazine that the backlash against the Beatles began. Now, Datebook was a magazine aimed at teenagers, but it also covered serious current affairs such as integration, the Vietnam War, and drug use, but they also enjoyed showing the human side of pop stars, which was something the Beatles appreciated. They liked the magazine and invited the editor-in-chief, Art Unger, on tour with them in 1965. Datebook cut down Maureen's nearly 2,000-word articles down to just 800 words. They pretty much just kept the interviews of Lennon and McCartney, and then pulled some sensational quotes for the headlines and front cover. Art thought McCartney's quote was going to draw the most attention, which is why his photo is on the cover of the magazine. Now, Art was a smart business guy. He knew that any type of Beatles coverage was going to be a big seller, but he thought he could sell even more copies by stirring up some controversy. And so in late July 1966, he sent some advance copies of the September issue to the southern United States, where he knew the Beatles quotes would generate a lot of attention. Among the first people to talk about the magazine were the radio DJs Doug Layton and Tommy Charles, who co-hosted a morning show on WAQY out of Birmingham, Alabama. For whatever reason, the DJs chose not to address McCartney's comments on race relations and instead jumped on the Christian remarks made by Lennon. Tommy Charles was so offended that he said, live on air, "That does it for me. I'm not going to play the Beatles anymore," which was a big deal since they worked for a top 40 station and the boycott could cost them some serious advertising dollars. They then invited their listeners to call and voice their own opinions, and the vast majority disapproved of what Lennon said. Tommy then decided they should build a bonfire using Beatles records and other Beatles paraphernalia as a protest when the band played their upcoming Memphis show on August 19th. They even started broadcasting a brief call to action that played hourly, asking listeners to bring their Beatles records and other items to various drop-off locations around Birmingham. And chances are the whole thing probably would have fizzled out if it wasn't for the actions of Al Ben. He was listening to the radio that morning and felt it was enough of a newsworthy story that it could get national attention. And since he was the Birmingham bureau manager for the United Press International, he was able to forward the story quickly to other news outlets around the US. The first article ran 2 days later on July 30th, summarizing the broadcast and featuring a quote from Tommy that said, "It's a shame because they're talented boys. They are as good as or better than any group today, but we think it's time somebody stood up to them and told them to shut up." Other radio stations, as many as 40, followed suit, issuing bans on Beatles music, although many of those stations only ever played country music and never played the Beatles to begin with, so a lot of it was just for show and jumping on a bandwagon. But honestly, a lot of these people were just looking for something to hate about the Beatles. I mean, there were comparisons being made between the hysteria of Beatlemania and religious worship. I mean, a lot of these people saw the Beatles as a threat. In 1965, Reverend David Nobel wrote, "Action taken now by concerned Christians and patriotic Americans is of the utmost importance. Let's make sure 4 mop-headed anti-Christ beatniks don't destroy our children's emotional and mental stability and ultimately destroy our nation." Yeah, so it's safe to say America was a powder keg ready to blow, and John's statement was the match that lit the fuse. The fervor surrounding John's comments was growing and getting hard to ignore. Newspapers at the time sensationalized the public reaction, and the office of Datebook magazine was bombarded with phone calls and letters asking for clarification on John's statements. The editor of Datebook was getting nervous for the Beatles themselves and called the Beatles manager Brian Epstein, telling him about the planned bonfires. But Brian seemed unconcerned as he reportedly told Arthur if they burn Beatles records, they've got to buy them first. However, Brian's attitude quickly changed when several of his US business partners told him to take the matter seriously. There was a growing concern that if nothing was done, some of the venue promoters in the United States might cancel the upcoming Beatles concerts out of fear of possible violence and riots, and the controversy could affect sales of the soon-to-be-released Revolver. To make matters worse, recently published interviews with Paul and George had quotes that could be seen as anti-American. And it's important to remember that just a couple of months earlier in June, Capitol in the US had their own smaller controversy with the infamous Butcher cover. Most retailers were appalled by the imagery and refused to stock the record. Negative feedback was so strong that Capitol ordered a buyback of all copies, making it the only Capitol Beatles album to lose money, at least when it was initially released. Brian was determined to put out the fire in America, and his first act was to stop any further comments. And so he sent a message to his assistant that said, "Please advise Beatles to continue not to speak to the press under any circumstances." Brian also seriously considered canceling the whole US tour out of fears that the Beatles could be harmed or killed. He even thought about having John record an apology at EMI Studios, but since John was not in London, he would have to be recorded over the phone, and so the whole idea was scrapped. It was then decided that the next step would be to hold a press conference in America.
I have prepared a statement which I will read, which has had John Lennon's absolute approval this afternoon with myself by telephone. And this is as follows. The quote which John Lennon made to a London columnist more than 3 months ago has been quoted and represented entirely out of context.
Despite Brian's statement, however, the press conference did little to quell the controversy, which now had become international. The Vatican denounced John's comments, there were protests in Mexico City, and Beatles music was temporarily banned on the radio in some countries. Although despite all the backlash within the religious community, there were a few that somewhat agreed with John. In a Jesuit journal, there was an editorial that said, "Lennon was simply stating what many a Christian educator would readily admit." The Beatles arrived in America on August 11th to start the final leg of their 1966 world tour, and they were rushed into a press conference almost as soon as they arrived at their hotel in Chicago. Brian and the Beatles press officer Tony Barrow took John aside and explained to him how important it was to set the record straight and explain his comments. John was torn because he stood by what he said, but at the same time, people took it the wrong way, and the threat of violence against him and his bandmates was very real. John was so upset that he broke down in tears. Tony later said, "He was trying, but not actually succeeding in hiding it from us. It was so uncharacteristic of the guy." Cynthia Lennon said, "He was terrified. What he'd said had affected the whole group. Their popularity was under the microscope, and he was the one who had opened his mouth and put his foot in it." There were also letters threatening violence and legitimate concerns that a sniper could be at one of their concert venues, which wasn't that far-fetched as 14 people were killed by a sniper at the University of Texas just a few days before on August 1st. During the press conference, John held his composure well and explained his words.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. But I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Essentially, John was saying that he was seeing a decline in church attendance and the rise in worship of other things, and he just happened to use the Beatles as an example. He didn't mean to say they were better than Jesus, but even then, there were others who asked if this was a deliberate attempt at provoking a controversy to sell more records. John replied,
"That's not a publicity stunt at all. Yeah. Don't need that publicity. Not like that."
John's apology was sufficient for a lot of people. The Birmingham radio station canceled their Beatles bonfire, the Vatican accepted his apology, and the New York Times stated the matter closed. But even still, tensions were high in the US with various protests and demonstrations. On the 12th of August, a Texas radio station held a Beatles bonfire with over 1,000 spectators. The next night, the KKK of South Carolina staged a Beatles crucifixion by nailing a Beatles record to a wooden cross and then setting it ablaze. The KKK also held a small demonstration at the Beatles' Washington, D.C. concert on the 15th. And the negative attention was a growing concern for the other Beatles as well. Ringo said, "We played a lot of places where people were getting really angry. The Ku Klux Klan were out in force, which was pretty frightening. There was always that edge in America. We knew they did have guns." Paul said, "By the time we got to the Bible Belt, there were people banging on our windows. I particularly remember a young boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old. If he could have got to us, I think he would have killed us." He also said, "It was the first time we started to see the power that could turn against us." But George reminds us that it was still just a vocal minority that were angry at the group. Apparently, the members of the Klan who were outside the stadium in Memphis got chased away by the fans, so although we were feeling quite frightened, nothing happened. Even still, their most potentially dangerous show was yet to come. On the 19th, the Beatles played 2 shows in Memphis, their only stop in the Bible Belt of America, a region known for its strong Christian and conservative values, and where most of the criticism was coming from. Out of fears of violence, the city council voted to cancel the shows, citing that they didn't want municipal facilities be used as a forum to ridicule anyone's religion. The Beatles played the shows anyway, sparking a Christian rally of roughly 8,000 people and more protests by the KKK, with one member interviewed for television.
Beatles made a statement in all the newspapers that they're getting more better than Jesus himself, and the Ku Klux Klan, being a religious order, is going to come out here the night that they appear at the Coliseum here. We have ways and means to stop this if this is going to be the case, yes.
What ways and means?
Well, I don't want to say this, but there'll be a lot of surprises Monday night, I believe, when they get here.
For the safety of the band, a 7-foot tall stage was constructed with a 5-foot wall in front of it to prevent fans from rushing the stage, which had happened at their Cleveland show on the 14th. Over 80 police officers and nearly 24 private security guards were tasked with protecting the Beatles. They did receive at least one anonymous message that said one of them would be assassinated on stage, and this became almost too real when a firecracker went off during the performance of If I Need Someone. The band initially thought it to be an actual gunshot directed at one of them, but like true professionals, they never stopped playing. Surprisingly, these shows were not sold out. There were only 22,000 fans in attendance out of a possible 26,000. By the 23rd, they played Shea Stadium again, but unlike their sold-out performance in 1965, there were 11,000 empty seats. The Jesus comments certainly affected ticket sales, leading many to think the Beatles were falling out of popularity. The last show of the tour was in San Francisco, and it just so happened to be their final traditional concert as a band. With the tour finished, the Beatles returned home to England and the controversy mostly evaporated. But with everything they went through, not just the protests in America, but also the events in Japan and the Philippines, as well as them just being tired of Beatlemania over the last few years, the Beatles needed a break from the Beatles. George would later say, "Beatlemania took its toll, and we were not longer on the buzz of fame and success. It was nice to be popular, but when you saw the size of it, it was ridiculous, and it felt dangerous because everybody was out of hand and out of line. Even the cops were out of line." For the next 3 months, each Beatle did his own thing. John acted in a film directed by Richard Lester, Paul dabbled in composing a soundtrack for the film The Family Way, Ringo enjoyed family life at his home in Surrey, and George traveled to India to study yoga, Indian culture, and the sitar. In late November 1966, the Beatles reconvened at EMI Studios to begin work on what would become Sgt. Pepper's. And it's funny to note that John wanted to have Jesus on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, but he did not get his way. After all, it's not like they wanted to bring up the controversy of the previous year, right? And that is a story of how a small but vocal group in the United States tried to cancel the Beatles. I find this such a fascinating slice of history, but I really want to know what you have to say. Do you think if John were to say this today, the same thing would have happened? Do you agree with him? Do you disagree? Do you think the whole thing was just blown out of proportion? I'm really curious to know. That will do it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. They really keep this channel going with their generous support. If you want to come join the fun, there is a link down below. Until then, I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.